3 weeks before I ended up sitting against my neighbor's door with blood on my collar and a cracked phone pressed to my chest. My family needed exactly one thing from me. Not my opinion. Not my time, though they'd been borrowing that for years without much accounting. Not my presence at Sunday dinner, though they'd used that too, as the delivery mechanism. They needed my signature. On $1.85 million worth of exposure my stepbrother had been quietly accumulating through a condo development in Kelowna that had been losing ground since the previous spring. They called it family. They called it temporary. My stepfather used the word straightforward 3 times in the same sentence. My mother passed the gravy and said, without quite looking at me, "We just need someone the lender trusts to stand behind Rami for a little while." When I said no, my stepbrother drove to my apartment in the Beltline at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in February, pushed his way through my door, and left me on my kitchen floor, while my own mother stood in the hallway and told the neighbor who had opened her door to please go back inside. This was a family matter. My neighbor called 911 anyway. What the Calgary police officers found that night wasn't only what had happened in my kitchen. It was what my family had been hiding inside a web of numbered Alberta companies, unpaid CRA assessments, and a construction loan with a private lender out of Surrey, whose guarantee clause had been written very specifically to make sure someone other than my stepbrother paid first when things fell apart. My name is Lydia Forsyth. I'm 28 years old. I work in corporate compliance for a mid-sized firm in downtown Calgary, and this is the story of the night I stopped being the responsible one. Before I get into it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there, because this started with a Sunday roast at my mother and stepfather's place in Mackenzie Town, and if you've ever sat at a family dinner and watched the entire room shift when you asked a single reasonable question, what I'm about to tell you will feel uncomfortably close. 3 weeks before everything collapsed, I was sitting in the dining room of my mother and stepfather's house in the southeast end of Calgary, watching candlelight move across the good china. They only brought out when something was about to be asked of me. That's not hindsight. That's a pattern I know by now. My stepbrother had driven in from Vancouver that weekend. He arrived at dinner in a new jacket and the particular energy of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation for days. He talked about the Kelowna project, 40 units on the west side of the lake, mountain views, pre-sales already 60% committed. He called it the opportunity of his generation. He described the projected returns with the confidence of a man who has never had to personally absorb the consequences of being wrong. My stepfather Howard sat at the head of the table and nodded at everything. Remy said the way a person nods when they already know the ending of the story being told. I had come straight from the office, still in my blazer, laptop bag dropped at the door. I had been in a review meeting that afternoon that ran long, and the drive down Deerfoot had been slow, and by the time I sat down I was already tired in the particular way that work in compliance makes you tired. Not from effort, but from spending 8 hours being the person who notices what other people prefer not to notice. Remy caught me watching him too closely from across the table. He smiled. "Still doing the spreadsheet thing, Lids?" "Still paying my own bills," I said. The table laughed. My stepfather's laugh lasted a beat too long. After dessert, when the coffee was poured and my mother had excused herself to the kitchen, a thing I understood later she did so she wouldn't have to watch, Howard set a folder on the table in front of me. Not beside me, directly in front of me, like the entire evening had been a long approach toward this moment. The tab read "Consigning support documents" in a font chosen for its inoffensiveness. Inside, a personal guarantee for a construction loan with a private lender registered in Surrey, British Columbia, a co-applicant form for a $340,000 equipment and vehicle credit line, a commercial lease guarantee for Remy's Calgary office space, and underneath those, documentation for an entity called 1189442 Alberta Limited, which was a company I had never heard mentioned before that night. Total exposure $185 million Canadian. Howard spoke in the careful voice he always used when he wanted something. The lender needs a secondary guarantor while Remy repositions some assets. It's short-term, clean, nothing complicated. He let a beat pass. Family takes care of family. I set the folder down and said, I'd need time to read through everything properly. The room went still, not loud still. The particular quiet of a room where oxygen has been gently removed and everyone is waiting to see if you notice. My mother came back from the kitchen, looked at the folder, looked at me. Remy needs an answer before Friday, she said, not as information, as a correction. Remy leaned back in his chair. You've always turned simple things into a process. Howard said quietly, there's a version of caution that's just fear with better vocabulary, Lydia. That was how they did it. No raised voices, no threats. Just the steady implication that hesitation was a character flaw. That And asking questions was same as the fee refusing, and that refusing was a kind of abandonment. I drove home along Deerfoot with the folder on my passenger seat and the city lights on both sides of the highway and something in my chest that had been quiet for years starting to feel very awake. I didn't sleep. By 5 a.m, I was at my kitchen table with the folder open and my laptop beside it. I know how to read corporate structures. I know what clean documents look like. And I know what documents that are performing cleanness look like. These were the second kind. 1789442 Alberta Limited had been incorporated 17 months ago. The registered address was the same postal box on 17th Avenue as Remy's other company, Apex Crest Development Corp. That alone wasn't unusual. But two registered companies sharing a mailbox, both tied to the same project, was a structure that existed for a reason. And the reason was usually not simplicity. I pulled the BC Securities Commission Public Registry. 2 investor complaints, both within the past 7 months. Allegations of misrepresented completion timelines and deposit funds not held in the required trust account. The construction lender's interest rate was significantly above what any Schedule A bank would offer a healthy borrower. That meant Remy had already been turned down by the banks. He'd gone to private money, which meant the lender had its own protections baked in. And those protections, I found when I read the guarantee clause carefully, included the right to pursue the secondary guarantor before exhausting remedies against the primary borrower. Before Remy, before anyone tried to collect from my stepbrother first, they could come directly to me. And buried in the refinancing schedule, a balloon payment of $610,000 due in 8 months on the flagship construction loan. No exit strategy in the documents, no bridge financing arranged, no disclosed source of funds to cover it. I sat at the table in my kitchen in the Beltline at 6 a.m. and understood exactly what the folder on my passenger seat had actually been. That Monday, before I went into the office, I drove to the financial district and knocked on the door of a woman named Miriam Chow. She's a financial litigation lawyer. I had worked alongside on a commercial fraud referral 2 years earlier. She reads documents the way certain people read maps, immediately, and with instinctive clarity about where the roads end. She went through what I had brought her for 22 minutes without speaking. Then she set her reading glasses on the desk. There are at least 2 entities here he hasn't disclosed, she said. One of them has a CIRA assessment outstanding. Penalties and interest not filed late, just not paid. That's a red flag for a lender doing due diligence, which tells me they either didn't do it, or were persuaded to overlook it. She tapped the guarantee page. This clause is unusual. It means that if the project defaults, the private lender can come to you first, before selling the asset, before pursuing Remy's own holdings. You'd be the path of least resistance. She looked at me directly. If you sign these documents, Lydia, you're not co-signing alone. You're accepting liability for a project that is already in regulatory trouble, with a lender who has structured this specifically so that you absorb the first impact. Your credit, your income, potentially your savings, all of it becomes reachable before his assets are touched. I sat in my car in the parkade for a long time. Then I drove to Mackenzietown to see my mother. I didn't call ahead. I rang the bell and Howard answered in his house slippers, and I walked past him to the kitchen and laid it all out on the island counter. The numbered company, the postal box address, the CRA assessment, the BC Securities Complaints, the balloon payment with no disclosed exit strategy, the private lender's guarantee clause. Every piece of it in order, plainly. My mother listened with her hands around her mug. She didn't look surprised, not even a little. That landed harder than anything else in the room. You knew, I said. I knew Remy was under pressure. You knew about the investor complaints. You knew about the balloon payment. You sat across the table from me and handed me documents that would let his lender come after me first. And you knew. Howard set his mug down on the counter with careful precision. Remy takes risks, because that's what people do when they're actually building something. Not everyone gets to stand on the sideline and call it wisdom. His voice was measured and steady. You've spent your entire career finding reasons not to trust anything. At some point that becomes its own kind of failure. The particular thing about Howard's contempt was that it always sounded like concern. I left before I said anything that couldn't be taken back. 2 nights later, on a Tuesday, my stepbrother came to my door. February in Calgary. Cold enough that the city goes quiet by 9 o'clock. I was at my kitchen table with Miriam's notes spread out and the Alberta Corporate Registry searches open on my screen when the knock came. Not a knock, really, more of an impact, hard enough to move the frame. I looked through the peephole. Remy. His jacket was open despite the temperature. Something in his face had moved past the place where people are still editing themselves. I put the chain on and opened the door. It's late. You hired a lawyer. He said it, The way you say a fact you've had a long time to be angry about. I got advice. You went through my business. His eyes moved past me to the table. Miriam's yellow sticky notes, the printed registry searches, the folder I'd labeled with the lender's name and today's date. He recognized what all of it was, and what it meant. Remy, go home. He put his shoulder into the door. The chain bracket came out of the door frame. Screws and all, one clean pull, and he walked into my apartment like the floor plan already belonged to him. I stepped back into the kitchen. Stop, you need to leave. His eyes were on the documents. You're going to blow up 2 years of work because you're too scared to take a risk that isn't even yours to take. I'm not signing. That is final. It was the first time I had said it without leaving any door open, without the softening. Just the fact of it, plain. What happened next came apart in pieces, the way things do when they're moving faster than understanding can follow. His hand on my arm, my shoulder into the doorframe, pain like a white flash, my feet losing the floor. The corner of my kitchen counter on the way down, something going over. A sound I understood in a detached way was the coffee maker hitting the tile, the linoleum against my cheek. I lay there and tried to take stock of what I could and couldn't move. Remy stood over me, breathing hard, looking at the documents scattered across the floor. One signature, he said. That's all any of this ever was. Then my mother's voice came from the hallway. She had followed him. She must have parked behind his truck. She was standing just inside my door in her winter coat, her keys still in her hand, and for one moment, one full, breathable moment, I thought she'll see this, she'll come. But my mother didn't move toward me. She looked at Remy first. Then at the papers on my floor. Her face settled into something I had never seen from her before. Something cold and finished, like a door being closed from the inside. You always push people to this point, she said. To me. Mom, I tried to sit up, my shoulder said no. He broke into my home. Mom, look at me. She looked at me on the floor. Then she adjusted her gaze slightly, to a point just past my shoulder. You brought this on yourself. There are sentences that don't arrive loudly. They just remove the last thing holding you upright. I reached for my phone. Screen cracked down the middle, still lit. Don't make this worse than it is, Howard said from somewhere behind her. He had come too. All 3 of them had come to my apartment building on a Tuesday night, which meant this had been planned, or at least anticipated. I need help, I said to my mother. You need to stop treating every request this family makes as an attack. She pulled her coat tighter. We're going, Howard. They left, my door hung open. Cold air came in from the corridor. I stayed on the floor and listened to the building settle around me, and tried to figure out what I could do without moving the shoulder. Then I heard a knock from across the hall. More of a tap, careful, not wanting to frighten. I'm calling 911. My neighbor's voice, low and certain. She's a nurse. She works overnight at Foothills. Her shift had been canceled that evening and she'd been home, awake, unable to sleep. She had heard the chain come out of the wall. She had heard all of it. Are you in there? Yes, I said. Please, yes. I woke up at Foothills Medical Center with my right shoulder immobilized, an IV in my left arm, and my Aunt Blythe asleep in the chair beside my bed, still wearing the fleece vest she'd had on when she drove in from Canmore. Dislocated shoulder. Some soft tissue damage. The emergency physician said I was fortunate it wasn't worse. I thought about the word fortunate for a while and what it was doing in that sentence. Aunt Blythe had gotten there before I woke up. My neighbor had found her number in my phone contacts. She was still holding her car keys when she arrived, apparently. She hadn't put them down yet. A detective from Calgary Police Service came in the next afternoon. Detective Nkechi Amara. She was direct and unhurried, and made space for information without decorating it. The kind of person who makes the truth feel like the only sensible choice. I told her everything. The Sunday dinner, the folder, Miriam's findings about the CRA debt and the guarantee structure, the photo Remy had sent me 4 days before Tuesday, a picture of me walking into Miriam's building downtown, taken from the opposite sidewalk, with a message that said only, I know where you're getting your advice. The Tuesday night, my mother standing at my door, what she said before she left. Detective Amara wrote without interrupting. When I finished, she looked up from her notebook. Your mother was present during the assault, and left without rendering assistance, she said. I nodded. We're looking at assault causing bodily harm. Criminal harassment. The photograph establishes surveillance. Potentially obstruction. She paused. Your mother may face a charge of failure to provide necessaries. These all have legal names, Lydia. This is not a family misunderstanding. It was the first time someone had said that, in those words. This is not a family misunderstanding. My neighbor had filmed the hallway on her phone from behind her peephole before she called 911. Shaky footage, muffled audio through the walls. But the hallway was clear. Remy arriving. My mother and Howard arriving 4 minutes behind him. And then as my mother stepped back into the corridor, a single sentence coming through without distortion. You brought this on yourself. The provincial courtroom was fluorescent and wool damp, and smelled like a building that processed difficult things every day and had stopped noticing. Aunt Blythe sat behind me. Miriam Chow was at my right. Remy sat at the defense table looking like a man who had been inconvenienced by a bureaucratic process he considered beneath him. My mother sat 2 rows behind the defense table. She did not look at me once during the entire hearing. Remy's counsel built the expected argument. I was overly cautious by nature. I had mischaracterized a normal family financial conversation. The events of that Tuesday night were an understandable emotional reaction to sustained provocation. Then Miriam stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She introduced evidence. The hallway footage, the hospital photographs, the corporate registry documents, the numbered companies, the shared postal address, the undisclosed CRA assessment, the BC Securities Commission complaints, the balloon payment with no exit strategy, the guarantee clause that put me in the lender's line of fire before my stepbrother, the photo he had sent me, with metadata placing it across the street from Miriam's building, the text message attached to it. The hallway audio played through the courtroom speakers. Muffled, then clearer, then my mother's voice. You brought this on yourself. The room went completely still. Under questioning, Howard acknowledged that he had been aware of the BC Securities complaints before the Sunday dinner. He said he had believed the family needed to resolve its financial situation collectively. The Crown prosecutor asked him directly whether that included asking me to assume $1.85 million in liability for a project he knew was under regulatory review. Howard said he had believed the situation was manageable. The judge asked him what evidence he'd based that belief on. Howard had nothing useful to say. My mother, asked directly by the Crown why she had left her daughter on the kitchen floor without calling for help, said she had believed the situation was already being handled. The judge asked what she meant by handled. She could not clarify. Remy was convicted on assault, causing bodily harm, and criminal harassment. The court also referred the financial structure to the Alberta Securities Commission and the Canada Revenue Agency for separate review. My mother was charged with failure to provide necessaries. She received a conditional discharge. 12 months probation, mandatory counseling, not custody. Some people thought it should have been more. I thought about it for a long time and decided that having to sit in a room once a week and explain her choices to a stranger was, in its own particular way, a form of accountability she would find harder than she expected. Remy received 16 months in provincial custody and 2 years probation. The Kelowna development went into receivership 4 months later. The investors filed civil suits. The private lender pursued his personal assets directly. Howard's name quietly disappeared from the boards and advisory committees he had occupied for years. Recovery is a strange word for it. It implies going back to something. I'm not sure what I was returning to, or whether returning was even the right direction. My shoulder healed. Physio twice a week for 2 months, then once, then the exercises on my own in the morning before work. It still catches sometimes when I reach quickly for something overhead. I've stopped apologizing for it. I stayed with Aunt Blythe in Canmore for 6 weeks. Her house is small and pine-scented and she makes coffee at 5:30, regardless of the day of the week. She didn't press me to talk. She didn't offer her opinion on my mother, which was the greatest gift she could have given me. She just made the coffee and left the chair across the table, empty, in case I wanted to sit in it. Therapy helped me name something I had been treating as a personality trait. I had spent years being the dependable one. The one who showed up and never asked for anything and quietly resolved things before they became visible to anyone else. I had believed this was simply who I was. My therapist pointed out, first gently and then more directly, that it was also a strategy, one I had built inside a family that rewarded usefulness and had no framework for need. I had confused endurance with strength for so long that I hadn't noticed I was exhausted. The worst injury was never my shoulder. It was looking up from my kitchen floor and understanding that my mother had made her choice, and that it hadn't taken her very long. Several months into recovery, I began doing financial literacy sessions through a non-profit organization in Calgary. Co-signing and personal guarantees. What co-applicant liability actually means under Canadian law. How to read an Alberta or BCC corporate registry search and what to look for. How to find outstanding CRA assessments in public records. How family pressure tends to sound indistinguishable from love, right up until the moment someone places a document in front of you and calls it paperwork. After one evening session, a woman in her late 50s waited until the room had emptied. She was holding her coat against her chest instead of wearing it. The way people do when they're still deciding something. My son has been calling what he asks me to do loyalty, she said, quietly. He's been calling it for 2 years. I've been signing things without reading them properly, because reading them felt like I didn't trust him. She paused. I didn't know I was allowed to read them first. I didn't know that was permitted. I had to look down at my notes for a moment. That was when what had happened to me became something other than damage. Late April. Aunt Blythe's kitchen table in Canmore, snow still on the peaks outside the window, morning light coming in low and amber across the countertops. She was doing her crossword. I was on my second coffee. She pushed a small box across the table, toward me, without looking up from her puzzle. Inside was my grandmother's ring. My real grandmother, my mother's mother, who had died when I was 11. The ring had been left to my mother, who had given it to me when I was 16, then asked for it back 3 years later. She said she needed it for something. I had never seen it again. She brought it to me 4 years ago, Aunt Blythe said, still on her crossword. She asked me to hold on to it. She didn't explain why. I think she knew by then that she didn't trust herself with it. I turned the ring over in my hands. On the inside of the band, small and worn, almost smooth but still readable. For the girl who knows the difference between love and obligation. My great-grandmother had it engraved. For my grandmother, and then, eventually, for me. I held it and didn't say anything for a while. Aunt Blythe filled in a square. She always knew who you were, she said, even when you didn't. That summer, a small group of people gathered at Aunt Blythe's back deck in Canmore, on an evening when the mountains were going dark blue at the edges, and someone had put out citronella candles along the railing. Not many people. Miriam Chow, Detective Amara, off-duty in a fleece and trail runners that made her look like an entirely different person. A colleague from my firm named Jess, who had once, during the worst week, saved me the parking spot closest to the elevator without saying anything about it. A few others. Simple food. Easy laughter. The kind of evening that doesn't need to be anything more than it is. Someone asked if I ever regretted it, pushing back, refusing to sign. Whether the cost had been worth it. I looked at the mountain line going dark against the sky. No, I said. The only thing I regret is how long I believed that surviving the people who hurt me was the same thing as being loved by them. The deck went quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that holds something in it that doesn't need to be said. Later I stood at the railing by myself and ran my thumb over the engraving on the inside of the ring, and listened to the creek somewhere below, the property running fast with snowmelt, cold and steady, and not going anywhere but forward. Some wounds don't fully disappear, but eventually, they stop being the thing that decides the shape of everything ahead of you. I turned back toward the warm light coming through the sliding door. Toward the sound of people laughing quietly over something I'd missed. Something small and ordinary and entirely without cost. Not the family I came from. The one I built on the other side of all of it. If you've ever been pressured to choose between your financial security and someone's definition of family loyalty, or if you've ever had someone frame your self-protection as betrayal, I'd really like to hear your story in the comments. It doesn't have to be dramatic to count. Sometimes it starts with a Sunday dinner and a folder set in front of you. And sometimes that's enough.